Canelo Alvarez is one of the sport's best pound-for-pound fighters. He's been competing at the highest level for over 15 years now, and as a result he's got one of the best resumes in the sport. However, some people may not know as much about the quality of his resume. So today, because Canelo is facing William Skull this weekend, I'm going to go through every single notable name on Canelo's record and rate them. And at the end we'll conclude how good his resume is. I made a very similar video 1 month ago about Tank Davis, which I recommend checking out. To go through the criteria of how good a resume is, I'm going to sort each fighter on his record into separate levels depending on their quality. Their quality can be determined by many factors, including were they world champions, do they go on to become world champions afterwards, were they in the same weight class as Canelo or were they bigger, were they on a losing streak or a winning streak. And as you can see, I've got some boxes for reference in terms of what sort of fighters should be in each tier. As many of these videos begin, the first 10-20 opponents of a fighter's career tend to be quite useless. All of Canelo's opponents up to 2009 are going to be automatically sorted into the D tier of journeyman, except for one, because you may notice that Miguel Vasquez is on Canelo's record for his third fight. Vasquez would go on to become a future lightweight champion. The first time they fought was actually Vasquez's debut, and they'd fight again 2 years later, and Canelo beat him both times by decision. So that's a sneaky name on Canelo's resume that no one really knows about, and I'd put Vasquez in the B fighter category. You could maybe justify him being higher because he did go on to become world champion, but 147 was never Vasquez's weight class. I think B is the right place for him. Then there's quite a lot of lesser known fighters who I'd put in the C tier. Yuri Gonzalez, Mikel Hernandez, Carlos Herrera, Leonardo Tainer. They're not recognisable names, but Mikel Hernandez went on to upset a 21-0 fighter afterwards. Tainer had been in there with the likes of Lamont Peterson, so they weren't difficult opponents, but they weren't quite layovers either. The first serious opponent of Canelo's career, in my opinion, was in 2010 versus Jose Cotto, who happens to be Miguel Cotto's older brother, who had fought for the title before versus Juan Diaz, which was a reasonably competitive fight, but it wasn't 135. Cotto had never fought at welterweight going into this fight, and this is a bit of a recurring theme when it comes to Canelo's resume. I think a weight class lower he would have been a B+ fighter, but since it's a different weight class, I'm going to put him in B, as Canelo would stop him in round 9. Then Canelo would take on Luciano Cuello, who's a C-level fighter. Then he'd take the first big name of his career versus Carlos Baldomir. Baldomir was a pound-for-pound level fighter at one point. He'd beaten Zab Judah, stopped Arturo Gatti in 7 rounds. But by the time Canelo fought him, he'd taken some beatings versus Floyd Mayweather Jr., Vernon Forrest and Jackson Bonsu, so this was not a peak Baldomir by any means. So despite how good he was at one point, I'm going to have to put him down to C tier. Then Canelo took on a more respectable opponent versus Lovemore Nadu. Nadu was a South African-born fighter who'd been in there twice versus a prime Paulie Malignaggi, the second fight being a split decision, then losing a competitive decision versus Kermit Cintron, then a draw versus Matthew Hatton. He's a decent opponent, he's going to go in the B tier. Then Canelo takes his first ever world title fight versus Matthew Hatton. Hatton was on a very respectable streak going into the fight, against opponents with good records, but Hatton wasn't actually a champion, it was a vacant title fight, so I can't rate him too highly. He's going to go in the B tier, as Canelo would then win the WBC super welterweight title. Canelo then fought another British fighter in Ryan Rhodes, an experienced veteran, but he'd never fought outside the UK at that point, so he goes in C tier. Then he takes on Alfonso Gomez. Gomez had recently stopped Jose Luis Castillo, stopped Arturo Gatti. Granted, there were two quite old versions of those two fighters, but he did get battered by Miguel Cotto, so there's a certain level about him. He's going to go in the B tier. Then Canelo takes on Kermit Cintron. Cintron was also a respectable opponent, went to a draw versus Sergio Martinez, but every time he fought above a certain level he got beat up. 2 times getting stopped by Antonio Margarito, beaten by Paul Williams, but he is respectable. I'm going to put him in B tier. Then Canelo takes on the first real proper well-known opponent on his record. Canelo took on Shane Mosley on the undercard of Mayweather versus Cotto. Now obviously you can say that Shane Mosley was old, which he was 40 years old. But he was always comfortable at 154, and he seems competitive at the world level despite his age, going the distance with the prime Manny Pacquiao in the middle of Pacquiao's historical run from 2005 to 2012 in his previous fight. So Mosley in his prime at 147 would be an A+++ fighter, but by 2012 when Canelo fought him, I think he was just about a B+ level fighter, so that makes Mosley the best opponent so far. Canelo then took on Josecito Lopez. Lopez was coming off a stoppage win over Victor Ortiz, went to a split decision versus future champion Jesse Vargas. Even later on in his career gave a tough fight to Keith Thurman, typical tough Mexican who makes it difficult for everyone. Canelo went through him in 5 rounds, and I'd put him in B tier. Canelo then takes on the hardest opponent of his career so far, Austin Trout, 26-0, undefeated in his prime. Trout had a massive breakthrough win the previous year, beating Miguel Cotto convincingly. Trout was a solid opponent but really failed to do anything before or after the Cotto fight. He never actually held a major world title. But considering his quality as a fighter overall, I'd put him in A tier. He's on the lower end of A tier, but he's there. Then Canelo takes a major step up versus Floyd Mayweather, the best boxer in the world. Obviously Canelo loses. I'm not the sort of person to put a loss on someone's resume, unless it's a really close or competitive fight, which it wasn't. Canelo then takes a bounce back fight versus Alfredo Angulo. Angulo was a standard C tier opponent. He loses to every recognisable name on his record. Then Canelo takes on erislandy Lara, a very talented fighter, a future 2-division champion, coming off a clear win over Austin Trout and his single loss being a massive robbery versus Paul Williams. Lara was clearly Canelo's best opponent at this point besides Floyd, and the fight reflects that. It was very close and competitive. I think since Lara was in his prime at this point, I think it's fair to put him as an A++ fighter, as an elite level win. Then Canelo takes on James Kirkland, a hard-hitting puncher. He was coming off a win over a 20-0 Glenn Tapia. No serious accomplishments, but he was a serious puncher, who I would put in B tier. Canelo went to war with him and put him to sleep in 3 rounds. Canelo then moves up to middleweight and takes on the legend Miguel Cotto. Cotto was actually in good form at this point. Despite his loss to Austin Trout, he came back and stopped Sergio Martinez and was the defending middleweight champion for this fight. But I can't give him too much credit, just like Shane Mosley, because Cotto was at the end of his career taking lots of damage in the process. I do think that Austin Trout loss was a bit of an off night, so I'm going to put him in A tier, because he was in good form, which is going to take us to a bit of a mismatch. Amir Khan. Canelo does sometimes have a history of facing smaller guys, but I don't think it's ever as egregious as the time he faced Khan. Khan started his career at 135, got knocked out at 135, moved up to 140, got knocked out at 140, then moved up to 147. He was decent at 147, but not good enough to justify a move up 2 divisions to 160 to face Canelo, and obviously the fight ended as expected. Despite how good Khan was in lower divisions, I think because of the size mismatch, I'm going to put Khan all the way down in B tier. Canelo then went back down to 154 to face Liam Smith. Liam Smith was the undefeated defending world champion at the time. Smith won the world title versus Apollo Thompson, but I don't really think Thompson was a title level opponent, and neither was Liam Smith really. He was good, but I'm going to put him in B+. Canelo then faces Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. This was a gimmick fight at the time. Chavez was stopped not long before this versus Andres Fonfara. I know Chavez was a champion at one point, but he was lucky to get that decision versus Sebastian Sabik. I'm going to put Chavez down at B tier. Then comes the big one. Canelo takes on the biggest test of his career since Floyd, Gennady Golovkin. If this was a win, Golovkin would have been an A+++ fighter, no question. Triple G had been dominating middleweight as a defending champion for about 6 years. There's a bit of a grey area in terms of where a draw should be on a resume. I think subjectively, if it's clear enough, it should be counted as whatever the score should have been. I think Triple G should have won 7 rounds to 5, so I'm personally going to count it as a loss. Canelo then takes on Triple G in a rematch. I think Canelo took this fight fair and square, to be honest, and I don't think Golovkin was that washed by the time the second fight happened either. If he's a AAA opponent in the first fight, he's a AAA opponent in the second fight, so that is an A+++ fighter on Canelo's resume. Canelo then moves up to 168, takes a tune-up fight versus Rocky Fielding. Fielding was decent, he'd beaten John Ryder before Ryder entered his second prime, but he did also get demolished by Callum Smith inside a single round. The Canelo fight itself was also one-sided. I think he's a C-tier opponent. Canelo then takes another major test in Danny Jacobs. Jacobs was the next best middleweight for years behind Triple G and Canelo himself. He gave Triple G his hardest fight before Canelo did, and if you look at the Canelo fight outside those certain moments where Canelo slips all those punches, it was actually quite a competitive fight. However, Jacobs didn't do too much outside of facing Triple G and Canelo. He was never actually a full world champion until he faced Sergey Derevyanchenko for the vacant IBF middleweight belt, so I'm not sure I'm going to put him in A++ next to Lara. Not only is Lara more accomplished, I think he's a better fighter overall, so I'm going to put Jacobs in A+, but this is Canelo's third best name to this point. Then Canelo jumps up 2 divisions to face Sergey Kovalev. Now this is a bit of a tricky one. On one hand, Kovalev is one of the best light heavyweights of the decade, and Canelo's jumping up 2 divisions to face him, but at the same time Kovalev by that point had already been knocked out by Alvarez, and he was given a very quick 3-month turnaround after going 10 rounds with Anthony Yarde. So there are a couple drawbacks to the win. I think I'll put him in A+ next to Jacobs. It wasn't too insane of a win considering that Canelo had already fought at 168, but Kovalev was the defending champion and there was a serious noticeable size difference anyway, so I think A+ is about right. Then Canelo takes on yet another defending champion, starting his super middleweight campaign versus Callum Smith. Smith had the WBA title and it was fought for the vacant WBC title as well. Callum Smith had just won the hardest tournament in the sport, the World Boxing Super Series, stopping George Groves in the final. But to be honest, considering the other World Boxing Super Series winners, Naoya Inoue, Josh Taylor, Alexander Usyk, Smith is clearly the weakest of them all. George Groves was the best they could offer for the final, and Groves had one arm for that fight. I also guarantee 99% of people watching can't remember who Callum Smith beat for the semi-final of that tournament. If you didn't know, it was a Dutch boxer called Nicky Hulzen. Smith did also scrape by decision versus John Ryder before the Canelo fight. Obviously that didn't stop British pundits from doing what British pundits do, which is predict the British fighter to win every fight. So there were some people picking Smith to win the fight. Canelo did beat him convincingly. Smith overall was quite a good opponent. He was big for the division, partly because of the size difference. I think he's an A-tier win, about the same as Austin Trout. Then Canelo took on Avni Yildirim. Canelo got some backlash for this one, but Yildirim was a mandatory and a tune-up fight before the Saunders fight. You might as well face him, he's a C-tier opponent. Then Canelo takes on, in my opinion, the best of the three super middleweight champions, Billy Joe Saunders, 30-0 two-division champion. As good as that may sound though, Saunders doesn't have much quality on his resume. His best win is between Chris Eubank Jr. and John Ryder, both fights being quite close. But regardless, Saunders was a very skilled, very talented opponent, and Canelo broke his face, in my opinion, the best performance of his career. I think he's an A-tier win, on the verge of being A+, but not quite. Then Canelo finally goes for Undisputed versus Caleb Plant. Caleb Plant was an undefeated champion for a couple years before this fight, his biggest win being versus Jose Euskategui. To me, he's a bit better than Callum Smith, but a bit worse than Saunders. He's also going in A-tier. Canelo's on top of the world, and he takes on Dmitry Bivol, daring to be great. Bivol would be an A+++ win, but Canelo took a step too far and lost to the better and bigger man. Now Canelo steps back down to face Triple G again in a trilogy, this time pulling Triple G up to 168. At this point there were serious signs of Triple G slowing down, as seen versus Dravianchenko and Ryoto Murata. The fight would reflect that being the worst and the most one-sided of the trilogy. Golovkin in the second fight was a AAA win, but by this point I think Golovkin's been put to a simple A-tier win, alongside the other guys at 168. Canelo then takes a tune-up and a mandatory fight versus John Ryder. I don't think Ryder's record really reflects how good he was. A bit similar to Marcos Maidana, obviously at a lower level. After his loss to Rocky Fielding in 2017, he switched trainers and started performing a lot better. He arguably got robbed versus Callum Smith, then got a win over Danny Jacobs, which to be fair was also debatable. Then before the Canelo fight he upset an undefeated prospect in Zach Parker, and he put on a good showing for himself versus Canelo. I'm not going to say he's an A-tier win, but he's not a bad win by any means. I'm going to put him in B+. Then, in a bit of a random move, he takes on Jamel Charlo, who's 2 divisions below him. Charlo was undisputed at 154, but obviously that's 2 divisions below Canelo, and the fight would reflect that, as Canelo bullied Charlo around the ring. I also don't think Charlo reflects the quality of other undisputed champions in this era, so for that reason he's only a B+ win. Then Canelo takes on Jaime Munguia. Munguia was actually on quite good form at this point. He was a former champion at 154, was undefeated, coming off wins over Sergey Derevyanchenko and a knockout win over John Ryder, and he did give Canelo quite a good fight. I'm going to put him in B+. Then he took on Edgar Berlanga. This fight's a bit difficult to defend. There were much better options besides Berlanga at 168. Pacheco and Billy, Morel. I thought he should have lost to Steve Rolls and Angulo, and the fact that Canelo didn't stop him is a bit concerning. But because of the size and the fact that Berlanga can punch, I think B tier is about right. Now, as of recording this video, Canelo's about to face William Skull tomorrow. Skull is a champion at 168, but he won the vacant title versus Vladimir Shishkin in a fight I thought he lost. After Canelo beats him, I think he's about a B+ opponent. I think he's a level above Berlanga. I think it'll go to a decision again, but I think Canelo's certain to win. Now, to fully evaluate the criteria, this is every opponent I mentioned in an organised format. As you can see, the only AAA opponent is Triple G in the second fight. A++ goes to Lara. A+ Jacobs Kovalev, A tier Trout, Cotto, Callum Smith, Saunders, Plant, trilogy with Golovkin. Then a step below that, guys like Shane Mosley, John Ryder, Jamel Charlo, Jaime Munguia, Liam Smith. Then in B tier, a lot of guys who fought early on, plus guys like Amir Khan, Chavez Jr., Rocky Fielding, Edgar Berlanga. Almost every C tier opponent is very early on, except for Avni Yildirim, and his only losses are to the best of the best. As you can see summarising it at the bottom, Canelo has fought in 27 world title fights, won 10 world titles, beating 18 people who were champions before, during or after their fight. then 8 opponents who were champions during the fight in the same division. As you can see, there's a lot of names, a lot of quality. Canelo has been doing it for a long time. I think if you compare it to a guy like Tank Davis's resume, where the highest an opponent goes is A+ with Ryan Garcia. Only 5 world title fights, 3 world titles, and only 2 champions who were champions during the fight. Once I make more of these videos, it's going to be easier to compare other boxers. But as it stands right now, Canelo I think has the best resume in boxing. That's not to say he's the best fighter in boxing. I don't think he's even top 10 pound for pound anymore. But of all the current champions, I think he's got the best resume. I'm going to make a video next week on Naoya Inoue's resume after he beats Ramon Cardenas. That's going to do it for the video. Like and subscribe. Leave a comment. Goodbye.